Welcome to session 319 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started this series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 15th of November. Today we'll be looking at Philippians 1 to 2 and Psalm 9. But first of all, let's get an overview of Philippians. Our next Pauline letter is Philippians, which is well recognised as being written by Paul to the church in Philippi around 55 to 63 CE. Paul is in prison and the Philippians send him a gift to support him. Paul then writes his letter back to them to thank them for their gift and as a general encouragement. This causes the letter to feel less urgent and corrective than some of the other letters that we read, that were writing to deal with specific issues in those churches. We read as Paul planted the church in Philippi in Acts 16. It was one of the first churches that Paul planted in Macedonia. Here is a summary of the structure, but I would recommend checking out the written version of this commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself, particularly as today there are three. If we start with Philippians 1 verses 1 to 11, the greetings and opening prayer. Then we have 1 verses 12 to 26, Paul's current circumstances. Then 1, 27 to 30, live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. This leads us to Philippians 2, be of one mind. Philippians 3, beware the false teachers. And Philippians 4, stand firm in the Lord in unity, peace and contentment. One of the key passages in Philippians is Philippians 2 verses 6 to 11. This is known as the Christ hymn, and some believe that it was a common hymn about Jesus that Paul included in this letter. It focuses on Jesus' divinity, which he emptied himself of to become human. This then becomes an example to the Philippians of how they should live, in selfless unity with one another. There's also evidence that those who taught circumcision that we encountered back in Galatians are still around and causing problems. So Paul warns the Philippians against them too. Finally, there seems to be a couple of women in the church at Philippi that have been in disagreement with one another for a while, which Paul takes a moment to address. But let's jump into today's reading, Philippians 1 to 2. Paul opens with greetings, but while normally Paul names himself as an apostle of Christ, here he goes for servant of Christ. This perhaps reflects the focus of the letter. In the other letters, we read Paul's authority being challenged, and so he needs to assert his authority to deal with some issue in the church. In those cases, it is important that the church recognises his apostleship and authority to point out these issues. Here in this letter to the Philippians, that isn't the case. And so instead he identifies as a servant of Christ to model for them what they are called to be. Paul greets the Philippians as saints and gives them a blessing before sharing how grateful for them he is. They have continued in the gospel that he first brought them. With many of the other churches, they were quite rocky, and it wasn't always clear if they would continue or if they would fall back into their old ways. When it comes to the Philippians, Paul is confident that they will continue in their faith and see it completed. Not only that, but the Philippians continue to share with Paul in the gospel. They continue to pray for him and send him gifts while he is in prison, and have been sharing the gospel with others. So Paul prays that the Philippians will grow in love and in knowledge so that they will better understand how to live and to continue to be formed in the image of Jesus. Paul then gives an update on his life. While he is in prison, God has been using that to help spread the gospel. Currently, the entire Imperial Guard are aware that Paul is in prison because of his faith in Jesus. These were the top of the top. They would guard the emperor, and sometimes they would depose emperors. It was the Imperial Guard that assassinated Caligula almost 20 years before in 41 CE and replaced him with Claudius. Then just 5 years before, they had helped lead Nero to power. This is an important and influential group to hear and be influenced by the gospel. And not only that, Paul mentions that many other believers have been encouraged to share the gospel because of his imprisonment. The reason for this varies. Some proclaim the gospel out of love, encouraged by Paul's sacrifice. Others do it to make a name for themselves while Paul is busy stuck in prison. But as far as Paul is concerned, both are fine. Either way, Jesus is spread to more and more people, which is a win. Paul particularly rejoices because he is confident that with the Philippians' prayers and the power of the Spirit, he can still be used for the gospel while in prison and Jesus will still be exalted. He explains to the Philippians that death is not something to be feared. If he continues to live, it means he has more opportunities to serve Jesus and share him with others. If he's persecuted and dies, then he gets to be in paradise with Jesus. In fact, if Paul had to choose, he'd much rather be with Jesus, but he recognizes that he still has work to do here on earth. The lesson for the Philippians is to not fear any persecution they face. Either they will live and God will use it to spread Jesus to more people, or they will die and be with Jesus. And so Paul moves to the main encouragement that shapes the rest of the letter. He encourages the Philippians to live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. That's Philippians 1 verse 27. If they do this, they will stand strong, stand united, and stand against their opponents who come against them. This is the blessing that God offers to them, to not only believe in Jesus, but to participate in his sufferings and mission of the gospel. Paul then unpacks what living a life in a manner worthy of the gospel looks like. First, it looks like being united and of one mind. The Philippians shouldn't seek their own benefit, but in humility seek the benefit of one another. Paul recites the Christ hymn, which, as we've mentioned, was likely a common hymn known to the church. Jesus was originally in the form of God. There's debate over what exactly this means. Some believe it means Jesus possessed the essential nature of God, capturing the idea that everything truly divine was present in him. Others interpret it as pointing to a divine majesty, much like royal robes signifying a king's status. In this sense, it reflects the visible glory and splendour Jesus had before becoming human. Another view draws a comparison between Jesus and Adam, suggesting that while Adam failed to fully reflect God's image, Jesus embodies humanity as it was intended to be, perfectly mirroring God. Either way, the point is that Jesus had a privileged position with God, but he was willing to give that up and empty himself of his divinity. Instead, he became human and poor. He humbled himself and was obedient all the way to the cross. Because of Jesus' humility and obedience, God then exalted him again, giving him the nature that is higher than any other name. Therefore, if Jesus was willing to give up his divinity and in humility and obedience do what is needed for the gospel, then the Philippians should do the same. Particularly as Paul is no longer there in person to guide them. They need to learn what it is to work out their own faith, because it is God, not Paul, who is ultimately in work in them. It is God that not only gives them the ability to work it out, but the desire and the will to do it. Paul then provides some practical suggestions. The Philippians shouldn't complain or argue about the work that they are given. Instead, they should be blameless and innocent in all that they do. That way, they will stand out against the wickedness of the world like a bright light. If they do all that, then it makes all that Paul suffered on their behalf worth it. Next up, Paul gives them two more examples, Timothy and Epaphroditus. Paul is sending Timothy to the Philippians soon. And like others, Timothy does not seek his own interests, but only seeks what is of Jesus. And the Philippians already know Timothy well. Then there's Epaphroditus, who has grown ill in his pursuit of the gospel. Paul is sending Epaphroditus to the Philippians to encourage them that he is still alive. Both of these men serve as an example and an encouragement for the Philippians for living a life completely offered up to God. But that's Philippians 1-2. Now let's look at Psalm 9. This psalm is attributed to King David and fits into the category of lament psalm, though you may not notice it straight away. This is because, unlike most lament psalms that begin with a complaint and end with a declaration of trust in God, this psalm does it the other way round. The first half of the psalm is dedicated to praise, and so to begin with, it would be easy to mistake this as a praise psalm. But following a chiastic pattern, a structure that mirrors itself, as the psalm reaches its turning point, the psalmist begins to raise their complaint before God. Here is a summary of the structure. We start with verses 1-2, praise. Verses 3-6, God has judged the enemy. Verses 7-10, testimony that God saves the righteous. Verses 9-11, praise. Verses 12-14, prayer that God will save the psalmist. Verses 15-18, God continues to judge the wicked. And then verses 19-20, prayer for God to intercede. Perhaps the biggest immediate takeaway from the psalm is the evidence that there is no one way for you to pray. In some situations, all you can do is bring your complaint. You're hurting and broken, and it's only after airing all that pain before God that you can bring yourself to declare that God is good. But other times, you might decide before you bring up your complaints, you need to remind yourself of the goodness of God, to put your complaints in their rightful place. It all depends on the situation and where you are at when you come to pray. What's so clever about this psalm is that there's a secondary structure that we don't see in the English. This psalm is an acrostic where each section, roughly every 2 verses, starts with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And that structure looks like verses 1-2, Aleph, praise to God. Verses 3-4, Beit, God is the one that has protected and sustained the psalmist. Verses 5-6, Gimel, God judged the wicked. Verses 7-8, Chet, God reigns enthroned over the world. Verses 9-10, Vav, God protects the oppressed. Verses 11-12, Zion, praise to God. Verses 13-14, Chet, a request for God to protect the oppressed. Verses 15-16, Tet, God's judgment on the wicked. Verses 17, Yod, the wicked shall go to the place of death, forgetting God. Verses 18-20, Kof, the poor will not be forgotten by God. Interestingly, Psalm 10 continues this acrostic on with the next Hebrew letter, Lamed. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.